The Indiana Hoosiers are set to embark on one of the more important off seasons here in the Mike Woodson era here in Bloomington. I'm Zach Browning for the Hoosier Podcast here, episode one of the Hoosier Podcast, brought to you by TheHoosier.com and powered by the Rivals Network. We're going to talk about some Indiana basketball off-season news and some transfer portal additions that we could potentially see or may need to see here for Indiana this season to try and get back to another NCAA tournament under Mike Woodson. My name is Zach Browning. I am your host, and today, this afternoon, I am joined by Tyler Smith, who covers Indiana basketball for us here at TheHoosier.com. He also covers the Indiana Pacers for Indiana Sports Legends. Tyler, how are you today?
I'm doing well. How about you, Zach?
I'm pretty good myself. Are you ready to get into things and dive straight in?
Let's do it.
All right, we will start first with where the Indiana Hoosiers stand now. They've had 6 players leave the program this offseason, 2 via graduation. Those would be Xavier Johnson and Anthony Walker. 3 transfers out, CJ Gunn, Caleb Banks, and Peyton Sparks. Gunn landing at DePaul, Sparks landing back at home in Ball State. And then obviously Khalil Ware, probably the biggest loss for Indiana this offseason. He's off to the 2024 NBA draft. Tyler, do any of those outside of maybe the obvious and the Hoosiers losing their leading scorer in Khalil Ware, do any of those really stand out other than Ware?
Nothing's been too surprising for me and for a lot of people for this offseason. Uh, the big thing is playing time and where guys fit. And if they're not, seeing the floor as much as they would like, then that's kind of more of the obvious choices of guys who will go to the portal. So to me, the entire offseason is kind of hinged on the M&Ms, Malik and McKenzie. And now that those guys have decided to return, I think you can build a nice core around those guys, in addition to some of the other guys that are staying to bring some leadership experience. But I don't think it's been too surprising, the guys that have gone portaling, and I don't think Kelly Ware going to the NBA draft is all that surprising either. So for me, it's been a pretty normal, not too surprising offseason to this point, and now the Hoosiers need to get to work when it comes to the transfer portal.
Lots of flexibility on this Indiana team. 7 roster spots taken up right now. 4 of those are guards. Gabe Cupps, Ja'Kai Newton, Trey Galloway, and Anthony Leal coming back for Indiana this season. And then, as you mentioned, the M&Ms, Malik Renew and Mackenzie Mbako coming back. And then the Hoosiers brought in a 2024 recruit, Bryson Tucker. He committed back in late March. The only recruit, yes, the only recruit in the 2024 class out of high school for Indiana. I guess looking at the Hoosiers' current roster, do you see a guy like Bryson Tucker factoring in a lot, maybe in terms of playing time a lot this season, Tyler?
Yeah, I would think so. I think that would be part of the conversation they had with him, the opportunity that's here to step right in right away. I've heard, Mike Woodson says that he doesn't guarantee starting spots or playing time, but that can also bring a challenge when you've got all these roster spots you're trying to fill. In those conversations, these guys want to know, like, where do I fit? Do I have opportunity to start? Do I have opportunity to play a lot? So it'd be very interesting kind of behind the scenes to see how those conversations are going, especially when you have 6 or 7 spots to fill. Those first couple spots that you're filling, you're not really, entirely sure what's coming behind those guys. So guaranteeing timing and playing time and starting spots is a tough thing, but Tucker's a guy that should factor in a really good opportunity to start, I think, for him. And I think Renew and Mbako are the other guys that are, pretty good guarantee that they're going to be in that lineup. But other than that, if I'm the Indiana coaching staff, I am not, trying to pick and choose as far as, trying to say I've got X amount of spots filled and I'm only looking for second unit or backups here. I would say go out and get the best talent you can find. Everything else will sort itself out once you get to that point.
So just kind of going in the line along the lines of trying to build out a roster and then putting the puzzle pieces together from there. You talk about McKenzie, Mbako, and Malik Renew in that starting lineup. Is that one of those situations? I've been on the train of McKenzie Mbako at the 4 spot and Malik Renew at the 5 spot for the last couple of months now, especially about halfway through this last Indiana basketball season. Are you kind of on that same page? Is this a situation where Mike Woodson should really think long and hard about playing Renew at the 5 and slotting in Mbako next to him at the 4?
I absolutely would. I've been on that train as well. The only issue there potentially is if there is a stud five that becomes available and wants to come to Indiana, that'd be tough to turn down. So if that go and get and is a guy that is more, suited for the starting lineup, then maybe you start with the two bigs, but you quickly move to one of them going to the five, Mbako at the four, some guards off the bench, and try to mix and match lineups a little more like they did a little bit more towards the end of last season. But if it was up to me, that's, the M&Ms. I'm looking at the 5 and 4. I'm looking at getting a big or two in the transfer portal, that guys that are willing to come off the bench and still play pretty heavy minutes, a rim protector, some rebounding. That's, defensively would be maybe a bit of concern. You're going to have to find some guards that can guard perimeter players and not rely so much, without that rim protection that Ware provided, and some of the rebounding you lose as well. But offensively, it is absolutely, I think, the way to go.
Now, we haven't talked yet about the guards that Indiana currently has on the roster, those being Ja'Kai Newton, Gabe Cupps, Trey Galloway, and Anthony Leal. From my point of view, Trey Galloway seems like the obvious number one in that kind of quartet of guards that Indiana still has, with Cupps, Newton, and Leal kind of potentially vying for playing time this offseason. You mentioned you wouldn't put Trey Galloway in that sort of guaranteed starter spot. Is he a guy that you could see coming off the bench? And for me personally, it's hard to believe that Galloway would really come back for a fifth year at Indiana if it were to be off the bench. I think he would come back to IU for a fifth season knowing that he's going to start probably 95% of the time.
Yeah, that's probably the plan, and that's probably what he's envisioning. At the same time, I know that he wants to win. So if they were to go out and get a bunch of studs on the wing, is he the type of kid that I would think, would be completely opposed to a sixth-man role? I don't think so. I think he would prioritize winning. And I think that's the possibility is there for them to have that type of team where a guy like him playing pretty close to starter minutes, but maybe as a six-man might be the way to go. I more than likely I anticipate him in the starting five, but it's just one of those situations where if I'm the coaching staff, I'm not giving any guarantees. It's an important year. We got to go out and bring in a lot of talent, and then let the chips fall where they may once we get this group together and see what they can do.
And with those other three guards, it's interesting. Ja'Kai Newton, Gabe Cupps, Anthony Leal. We didn't see Ja'Kai Newton at all last season. He redshirted last year. Gabe Cupps started a handful of games, a lot of games actually, with Xavier Johnson out. And Anthony Leal was more of a second half of the season type of guy. He was added into that Indiana rotation. I'm curious to see what Mike Woodson's plan is for those three, because you've got a guy in Ja'Kai Newton. He's a former four-star recruit, a top 100 type of guy. I'm curious to see how he kind of figures in to that rotation. If we see a lot of Gabe Cupps and Ja'Kai Newton in the backcourt off the bench this year, if we see a lot of Anthony Leal, or if Mike Woodson's going to try and bring in guys to maybe play over them, it'll be interesting to see what Woodson decides to do with the backcourt, how many guys really he's looking to bring in.
Yeah, and there's a lot to be determined there. For Newton, it's all about health. Obviously, he's expected to play. So is he back to 100%? Will he get to that point by next year? Because he's got an awful lot of talent, top 100 on a lot of lists. Guy that I think really would have helped this team a lot this past season. So if he's healthy, he can be kind of a combo guard. He's got skill on both ends. He can, really get into on the defensive end as well. So yeah, it's going to be interesting. And again, with so many spots to fill, there's just a lot to be determined. And so once those pieces start to kind of fall into place, maybe there's a better idea. But I think, again, if I'm the staff, I'm thinking, let's go get 10, 12 guys that we feel like can be in the rotation. And then, that competition that they'll have through camp and through practice will only help kind of internally to see where those pieces fit.
And real quick, one more thing on these three guards that are expecting to come off the bench. Gabe Cupps and Anthony Leal to me are kind of separate instances and kind of a separate discussion from Newton, because Newton to me is kind of a guy that you watch him play in high school, he kind of figures to be like an Xavier Johnson type at the college level. A lot of athleticism, a lot of quick twitchiness and burst with the ball in his hand. Not maybe the best shooter, but a guy who can get to the basket, a guy who can play make for others and for himself. So with the infatuation really that Mike Woodson had with Xavier Johnson over the last couple of seasons. I wouldn't be surprised if Newton factored heavily into this rotation for Indiana this year because of that. But with guys like Gabe Cupps and a guy like Anthony Leal, to me, it's all about shooting. If they can prove throughout practice in the early part of the season, if they can shoot, they'll see the floor. And I think for those two, it might just be as simple as that. Am I wrong in that, Tyler?
I agree with you. And, shooting is the great separator. I don't think every single player that Indiana grabs this offseason is going to have a high shooting percentage. Ideally, they get some that do. But I don't think fans should freak out if there's a few guys that they get that don't have this amazing three-point percentage, but guys that are playmakers and can get to the rim and are dynamic ball handlers and all that in their creativity. But you look at guys that you mentioned, if they can knock down shots, that's what's going to get them on the floor. So I feel like, especially with a guy like Cups, who had, he was more of a facilitator, even though he's playing major minutes. Ideally, if they go and get dynamic point guard and he's more of a backup off the bench, and you can, plug and play, mix and match with him, that would only make Indiana better and make them deeper. But if he comes out and works hard along with Leal and they're knocking down shots left and right, all through practice, then that's only going to help them and Indiana to make them deeper and make them more dangerous.
All right, now, Tyler, we've talked about Indiana's current roster makeup, the seven guys that make up the current rendition of Indiana's roster heading into really the meat and potatoes of this offseason. We've kind of beat around the bush a little bit, but we'll jump into Indiana's biggest offseason needs now for the transfer portal coming in this offseason. We each have two, and I'm going to let you go first here. What is your biggest offseason need for the Hoosiers entering this really important offseason for Mike Woodson and his staff?
Well, I think fans know this. They need a little bit of everything. There's a lot of needs, but the opportunity is there to go out and get basically every need that they have. But as I was thinking about the top one, for me, it's bringing in a dynamic point guard, somebody that can run the show. Again, even if it's not your typical knockdown shooter, if it's a guy that can really facilitate, get the offense where they need to be. We've seen so many amazing point guards throughout the tournament that we just watched. All these teams that make a deep run, they've got that guy that can do that. So we also saw glimpses last year when Indiana was better, when Xavier Johnson was not only healthy, but in the games he was playing well, how, different Indiana was. So for me, a guy like Miles Rice, who is out there, he should be a top priority. I've seen a lot of IU fans who have started to realize how talented that he is. And if you just look at three-point shooting for him, you're not going to get the whole story. Like, he's a dynamic player who can create, super talented, the type of guy, especially as a young kid, that I feel like could take off here pretty soon, one of these next couple of years. And Indiana's got to get a guy like him. If they don't land him, they've got to get a guy like him, for me, as a top priority.
Looking at a couple of point guards that Indiana's potentially been in contact with, we've got a guy like Leland Walker. He's been a guy I was fortunate enough to see him in high school. When I was in high school, he was in high school at the same time. I was fortunate to see him. That guy's a guy that can just go and get buckets. But going off of what you said about Rice, is maybe the point guard spot maybe not as important to go out and find a knockdown three-point shooter. It's more of a guy who Indiana can trust with the ball in their hands at this point, not necessarily a guy who can just straight knock down the long ball.
I think so, because especially if you're talking about at times when they've struggled, when they've been a little one-dimensional offensively. Some fans would argue they're playing to their strengths, playing through the post and all that, but at times they just didn't have that dynamic. Could create his own shot. So, to me, point guard that you can, whether or not roster spots you can fill, that can get to the rim and can create for his
Maybe a couple of other guys that fit that bill. A guy like Tony Perkins out of Iowa, Corinne Johnson, he's out of Washington. He has Indiana in his final list that he's going to choose from. And Cannon Carlisle, a guy from Stanford, he's on that younger side too. Not a great shooter, but a guy in Cannon Carlisle that I like out of the transfer portal for the Hoosiers. We'll move on to my first need, and we talked about it a little bit earlier. It's at that center spot. a backup big, a guy who can protect the rim, a guy who can rebound well at that backup center spot, because we know Malik Renew. Malik Renew is not the best defender at that 5 spot. He gets in foul trouble a lot. So there's going to be minutes to be had at that backup center spot, whether it's in the starting lineup or whether it's off the bench. So I think a guy who can really complement and pick up on what Renew's weaknesses are, those being defense and rebounding. If you can get a guy out of the portal that can do both of those things, protect the rim and rebound at an elite level, I think that's a massive get for Indiana. And a couple of guys that I'm circling here at this spot are a guy like Amari Williams out of Drexel, who's a 3-time Conference Defensive Player of the Year. That just speaks for itself. Pharrell Payne, a guy we saw at Minnesota with the Gophers the last couple of seasons. He's another guy. He's more of a high energy guy, kind of like I don't want to disrespect Peyton Sparks, but kind of like an improved Peyton Sparks, a guy who's going to bring energy off that bench for Indiana. And then Aaron Bradshaw. He's a talented former McDonald's All-American out of Kentucky. He doesn't have really a ton of ties to Indiana other than the fact that he played AAU with Mackenzie Mbako. But to me, maybe not the biggest priority, but definitely Indiana's going to have to go out and get a backup big who can really contribute at a high level this offseason for the Hoosiers.
Yeah, I agree. Out of the 20 plus names that we've seen, most of them have been guards and wings, which is obviously a priority. But same time, with Ware gone, with Renew often in foul trouble, plus to account for injuries, and as we've talked about, rebounding, rim protection, some of the names you mentioned there, it's important for Indiana to land at least one of them. I saw that, I believe it's this weekend, Payne is visiting, and then Williams is the 19th through the 21st. So a lot of movement coming here pretty soon, but I definitely agree with that as a priority as well.
Yeah, I believe Amari Williams is coming that weekend that you mentioned, 19th to 21st. That's a little 5 weekend here at IU. I think Cameron Carlisle is joining him on a visit that week. And then, yeah, Pharrell Payne expected to visit at the end of this week with the dead period ending tomorrow, I believe. Now, Tyler, what is your second choice or your second pick for a big offseason need for the Indiana Hoosiers this year?
Well, we've teased a little bit, and this is maybe more of the obvious one, but they got to get some shooters. And as I've mentioned, obviously I joked with some tweets earlier in the year about, go out and get X, this, and this, and about 15 shooters. But obviously, if they can go out and get a couple that are really strong shooting the basketball, then that's going to be huge. You hope that other guys improve on what they did last year. But my hope is that Indiana doesn't just bring in the one sharpshooter that they've tried to do it in years past and put a lot of pressure on him and say he's the guy. Ideally, they get multiple guys. So some of the names that we've heard, Connor Hickman, who has a visit coming up soon. I haven't heard a ton about Cade Tyson from Belmont, but he's a guy that 45% or so shooting from three, can play the 3-4. Not sure how connected Indiana is there, but and then the other one, the Indiana State kid, Conwell, who just entered the portal, was a 40% shooter, 16 points a game, was a big game player, played with confidence. Indiana needs multiple guys. So I'm looking at, can they not only get a Miles Rice type player, but can they pair him with a dynamic shooter who's playing the shooting guard position? And it separates so many things. It covers so many weaknesses. If you can just knock down some shots, and just think how much better a guy like Malik Renew would be, and Tucker getting to the rim, if you have a couple guys out there that can knock down shots. So that's, to me, those are some of the names, but Indiana's got to find multiple shooters this offseason.
And I think Indiana is really in the same boat as a lot of teams in this kind of position, trying to get shooters. Shooters, you can really never have too many of them. So a lot of teams around the country are really going to be going after some of these shooters. And a guy like Ryan Conwell, I really like Conwell's game. I may be a little bit bullish on him because I saw him play in high school at Pike, but that's a guy who can score. Lefty shooter. He's got great touch, not only from the 3-point line. That's one thing that I think separates maybe Tyson, or maybe separates Conwell from a couple of other guys that are wing shooters that Indiana could look to bring in. He's got him off the bounce game too. He's not just a catch and shoot, standstill 3-point shooter. So keep an eye on Ryan Conwell. He just entered the portal yesterday. No rumored contact yet from Indiana, but definitely a name to keep an eye on. And this kind of segues into my second need, and it's not a specific positional need. It's not a player. It's not anything like that. It's a philosophical change that Indiana needs to undergo. Less post-ups, less long twos, more 3-point shots. Let's see some 21st century basketball out of Indiana perhaps this next season. Yes, you can still play around Malik Reneau. Purdue just did it this last season with Zach Edey. They still played around a post player in Zach Edey, but they had shooters. They shot 40% from 3-point range this season, and that's how you win. If you're Malik Reneau, the best opportunity for you to score is when there's less guys trying to double team and triple team you and surround you in the paint. And the way you do that is by surrounding Reneau with a bunch of guys that can knock down the three, or even a bunch of guys that can at least attack off the dribble and attack closeouts, or at the very least be a threat to knock down a 3-pointer or two. So I think really the biggest one for me here in this philosophical change is just taking more threes. And a lot of Indiana fans in the last year or so have really complained that Mike Woodson just simply doesn't like to shoot threes, that he's stuck kind of in a 1990s, early 2000s brand of basketball. But looking at his head coaching stops, at least in the NBA, and I obviously know the NBA is different than the college game. There's different levels of talent, different levels of skill sets. But Mike Woodson's New York Knicks teams were always in the top 10 in 3-point attempts per game for the entire season, throughout his 3 seasons as the head coach with the Knicks. He has guys. He is a guy that has coached teams that shoot the 3 ball. It's just this last season with 2 centers that you're really trying to force the ball into the post. He's really got to open up and be flexible, I would say, this offseason. So I think that philosophical change of less post-ups, less long twos is probably the biggest one. The post-ups can still come, especially if you're going to play through Malik Reneau, but there's got to be more 3-point shots for Indiana. We've talked about that a lot. It's kind of the big theme of this offseason. It was one of the biggest themes this past season for Indiana. The 3-point shot has to be part of Indiana's game.
For sure. And, I feel like if they play a more modern style, take a team, obviously the 2-time defending champs, UConn, look at what they did with their big, who was playing in the high post a lot. They did a lot of Princeton type actions, Zoom type actions, Spain actions, with, still going through him a lot, but 2-man game. He still gets plenty of touches, but, they're playing through their guards and just a much more modern style. So I feel like if they even philosophically change to some of that, a little bit more of that, then I think the threes will come, and obviously having shooters will help. But yeah, I agree with you there as well, and the philosophical change that is needed.
Now we've kind of gone through maybe some of the positional, or in my case, philosophical needs and stylistic changes that need to come for Indiana this offseason. We have some quick rapid fire things to go over before we close out this first episode of the Hoosier podcast. First off, Tyler, it's an interesting debate. People go back and forth on this inside the transfer portal, at least maybe specifically for Indiana. Is it better to prioritize experience or prioritize youth to try and quote unquote build a program with multi-year guys?
Personally, I think it is best to do both. Season where you've got, 8-10 spots that you got to fill every year. That's hard to do. That's hard to sustain, even though we've seen, UConn had a lot of transfers. Alabama had 6 key transfers that played multiple minutes. So it can be done, but it's harder to do. The thing for Indiana this year, this is, a must-win season for the staff. Mike Woodson and his staff have to not only have a good year, they need to have a really good year. And also to get the bitter taste out of everyone's mouth from this past season. I feel like getting a guy like Tucker is a good thing to not get shut out in that class. And you've got some young pieces, you've got some older pieces coming back, but I feel like he's probably going to prioritize the guys that are later on in their career, like a Perkins type, those kind of guys left. But we've seen also in March, experience wins. So I feel like they're going to lean a little more towards the side of experience because of how important it is to win. Ideally, they also get at least a couple young pieces that you can potentially build with all again.
Yeah, you make a good point there. And I think it's more so, even just to break down a little further, it might be a little bit more positional based. Like you look at guards in the portal, guards, especially in March, experienced guards are what wins in March. You got to have experience in that backcourt. Yes, you have a 5th-year guy in Trey Galloway. Bring in a guy like Miles Rice. While he may be great on paper, is he too young to really lead a team through a tournament run in March in the NCAA tournament? I would probably lean towards no, but some people could probably think that way. So I think when you're looking at guards in the portal, you might prioritize or might focus on a little bit more experience and a little bit less on the youth. But when you're looking at those wing spots, looking at maybe a backup big, that's where IU could look to potentially prioritize maybe a little bit younger players to try and have for multiple seasons. One more question for you, Tyler. One more topic to discuss. Talent versus production in the portal. You look at a guy, maybe a guy we talked about earlier this season, like Leland Walker earlier in this show. He's a guy that wasn't highly recruited out of high school, but he had a fantastic season this past year at Eastern Kentucky. He's had production. He's shown that he can do it at the college level, but he wasn't necessarily highly recruited. Then you've got some other guys, maybe like an Aaron Bradshaw type. He's a former 4 or 5 star guy. Maybe didn't produce a ton at Kentucky as far as the statistics are concerned, but you know there's talent in there. How do you kind of balance that talent versus the actual physical, tangible production in the portal?
Yeah, that's it may sound kind of like a cop out for me, but I feel like it's similar in that to my previous answer in that I feel like Indiana can afford a mix here with so many spots. They can go out and get a couple guys that have a high ceiling talent wise that maybe hadn't all come together yet, similar to where of last season. If they can identify somebody that has a lot of talent that's not really tapped into their potential yet, they go after that. But especially once you fill your priority spots, guys, that you really feel like, you know, these are bucket getters or these are guys that we have a ton of confidence in. They're going to come in and produce right away. So I feel like it should be a mix. Again, in such a win now season, I feel like they're maybe going to lean more towards the guys that have produced. And honestly, it may pain them to say this, but take a page out of the rivals book when you listen to Matt Painter talk about how, you know, even in that loss to UConn, he talked to his guys after about the sacrifices that some of those guys made. So as you're talking to 20, 30 plus guys this offseason, you know, is it just about, you know, what kind of NIL do I get? Is it just certain things, or is there an element of I really want to win? I want to be part of something. I want to be part of a team, because you can have a lot of talent. Can it fit together? So I think experience and production will be prioritized specifically this offseason with a few guys that have a high ceiling that maybe they can tap into more. But will it fit? Will it come together as a unit? That is something that the staff has got to figure out.
Well, we've talked a lot about Indiana's offseason guide, really, so to speak, the transfer portal, where Indiana stands now with their roster, a lot of open scholarship spots available, a lot of flexibility open to Indiana this offseason. We talked a lot about what Indiana really should look for in the portal, that being some guard play, some shooting, some rim protecting at that backup big spot, maybe a philosophical change slash a stylistic change as well. A lot of buzz around this Indiana offseason, as I mentioned at the top, Tyler. It is an important one. Thank you so much for joining me here this afternoon on the first episode of the Hoosier podcast to talk about some Indiana men's basketball. You can stay up to date. All of our listeners can stay up to date on all the latest Indiana sports news and Indiana basketball offseason news at thehoosier.com and on our socials. That's Indiana Rivals on X/Twitter and on Instagram and Facebook as well. You can follow me on X/Twitter at ZachBrowning17. Tyler, you want to go ahead and plug your socials here?
Yeah, my Twitter is Tyler Smith_ISL.
Well, all of these episodes of the Hoosier podcast can be found on thehoosier.com, on the Hoosier on YouTube, and anywhere you get your podcasts from, just search, quote, the Hoosier podcast, and you will find us there for your ability to listen. Well, that is going to do it for us. Thank you all so much for tuning in to the first episode of the Hoosier podcast. Have a fantastic rest of your day.